On a winter morning, when demolition crews rolled two yellow excavators onto Mare Street, the boarded-up Odeon breathed out a smell of damp velvet and mouse nests that seemed older than dust. The cinema had been dark since 1998, its facade scabbed with plywood and fading posters trapped under sun-bleached acrylic, fragments of faces and taglines from a decade that had moved on without looking back. The council notices were posted, the utilities cut, the metal shutter pried open. What nobody planned for, when the first flashlights swept the auditorium like a small, man-made sunrise, was that a story London had half forgotten would be sitting patiently in row G as if waiting for the next showtime. The projectionist's name had been Alan Mercer. In 1997, he was 39, bookish and pale, with thinning black hair that he combed back with two fingers. He kept a leather-bound notebook in the breast pocket of a brown corduroy jacket and wrote in a small, neat hand that never betrayed hurry. He made tea the way old projectionists did, black and strong, poured into a chipped enamel mug that lived on a shelf beside spare splicers and brushes. He wore a slim silver bracelet on his left wrist, a gift from his sister the Christmas their mother died, and he touched it when he concentrated, as if tightening an invisible screw. A small photograph of that sister, Helen, was pinned to the corkboard in the booth with a thumbtack that left rust as it aged. He lived alone in a one-bedroom flat above a shoe repair shop on Wells Street. The landlord later told police he paid on time, liked quiet tenants, and sometimes left a book open, face down, as if saving a conversation for later. November 27, 1997, had been a Thursday. The Odeon ran a late show of The English Patient. The lobby, already shabby by then, held two arcade cabinets that flickered even when unplugged and a carpet dark with gum shadows. 3 ushers worked that night, and a manager named Patel counted the float in the office, all of them filling forms and selling popcorn without imagining their routines would turn into someone else's archive. "Mercer's up there," Patel told a new hire, pointing to the booth window. "Always is." The new hire glanced up and, for a second, saw the triangle of light, dust drifting like small planets in a galaxy of celluloid and cigarette smoke from another time, even though Mercer never smoked. He wrote in the book, "Bulb is a little temperamental. Remember to nurse the first changeover." Saturday, clean gate. The film ended at 11:02 p.m. The ushers held doors and joked with the last couple out. One of them, a kid with a shaved head, took a cigarette breakout back and saw, he swore later, a rectangular patch of light spill briefly from the booth onto the alley and then go dark. At 11:15, according to the manager's watch, the booth was locked. At 11:22, the usher named Carla met Mercer on the stairwell landing. "Night, Mr. Mercer," she said. He nodded. She remembered the jacket draped over his arm and the bracelet flash when he shifted his mug from one hand to the other. That glimpse would make its way into her statement, and then into a decade of retellings, growing crisp with repetition, even as everything else around it blurred. In the morning, Mercer didn't show. When he didn't answer his flat's buzzer at noon, the manager phoned Helen. "He's likely gone to the supplier," someone suggested, but by evening the worry had a shape. Police came the following day. They found his door double-locked from the outside with the key missing. Inside, the kettle was cold, the bed made. On the small table by the window, a green book about early Technicolor lay open face down, a string of page markers feathering the gutter. The enamel mug stood in the sink, a stain of tannin making an imperfect ring no amount of scrubbing had ever fully beaten. On the bureau rested a roll of film secured with a rubber band and a ticket stub for the previous night's show. In a drawer, letters from Helen, a return address and Haringey. The way siblings keep one another's handwriting close like a lighthouse scene between weather. He owned no passport. His bank account showed no withdrawals. The manager told the police Mercer rarely left East London except to visit an ailing aunt in Essex. The official search was brief in the way searches often are when a life does not announce a crime loudly enough to attract budget. Officers spoke to staff, to the night cleaner who swore she saw him on the stairs at something past 11, to 3 regular patrons who knew him only as the shape in the booth window. They found no blood, no struggle, no note. The building's architecture, a once grand 1930s design now compromised by adaptations, offered hiding places that were also simply spaces. False walls behind fabric that concealed ducts, crawlways running along the crown of the auditorium, a void above the ceiling where insulation drifted like yellow snow. They did not tear into these. Not then, not for a man who might have decided to stop leaving his mug in the same place each night. The file received a thin stack of pages and a conclusion that looked like a shrug tuned into official language. Possible voluntary departure. "Run off," said the landlord when he brought up the rent to the next tenant, years later. People do. The ushers finished their seasonal contracts and moved on. The manager changed branches. The Odeon slid through a last spring, a final summer haunted more by empty seats than by ghosts, and then closed. Stripped of its reels and marquee, it became a sealed box where pigeons nested, Teenagers dared each other, and the homeless slept when they could ignore the cold in their bones. A rumor grew that if you stood very still in the center of the auditorium, you could hear a faint, mechanical or like a projector thinking about starting. We tell ourselves things. It is how we comb the hair of the dark. 25 years later, Demolition Day began with a chai poured from a thermos lid and a sight briefing in air so raw the foreman's breath looked like a small locomotive. The workers cut the chains, pushed through the metal shutter, and wrestled light into a place that had taught itself to live without it. The lobby coughed dust. A mouse ran in a parabola between two poster cases. The paper inside those frames had fused to the glass with time, and the faces, Julia's, Ralph's, had melted into blots. The crew leader, a man called Staines, tried the inner auditorium doors and frowned. He put a shoulder into them, stepped back, and frowned again. "Bolted," he said, from the inside. It took a pry bar and a little cursing to shear the bolt. When the door finally gave, the daylight fell into the auditorium and died after 3 rows. Beyond that, the flashlights won jurisdiction. Rows of velvet seats sank as if in prayer. Dust hung like weather. In row G, seat 14, a figure sat with the pose of a patient patron waiting for previews to end. If you have never seen a human body turned from person to object by time and air, your mind tries to preserve the personhood longer than the light will permit. The forensics specialist later used mummified, which is a word that protects the living from details. The figure wore a brown corduroy jacket over a shirt whose color was now just a suggestion. The skin was dry and clung to bone with a thrift that looked almost stern. The head tipped very slightly to the right. Hands rested on the notebook that lay open across the lap. On the concrete beside the seat, an enamel mug lay on its side, handle intact. The last of its liquid had long since evaporated and left a tied line. From the left sleeve cuff, where the fabric had fallen back, a thin silver bracelet ringed the wrist and winked when a flashlight found it. The notebook's last entry had not smeared or even faded. The rectangles of graphite still crisp, as if waiting for a supervisor to initial them. Final show 2300 hours. Don't forget the key. The police, summoned from a job they had hoped would be simpler. A car without owner, a domestic without blood, worked the Odeon as if it had been built yesterday. They established that all doors save the one were chained and padlocked from the outside, that the windows had been boarded in 2000, that the ventilation, where it still existed, offered slats too narrow for a body. Their light probed the aisles. They found the inner bolt sheared by Staines's bar. A pity, the Soko murmured. But that's how real days work, and they found no footprints in the dust between door and row G besides the new ones. They followed a path down the left aisle where upholstery had acted as sponge for moisture and left a dark thread that never entirely dried. They bagged the bracelet and mug and notebook and moved the body with a tenderness that wrecking men, having known heavy things, watched with wet eyes. The pathology did not pretend what it could not say. Alan Mercer had likely died in late 1997 or early 1998. The desiccation of the air, the protection from insects, and the sealed chamber had worked together to mummify rather than rot. There were no fractures, no knife wounds, no bullet trauma, no ligature marks. The stomach, such as could be read, held little beyond tea. The heart had stopped. The cause of that stopping remained a piece of a jigsaw nobody could shape. The forensic artist drew a tentative portrait that looked like the man in the personnel file, only thinner, and the sketch made the news. The locked room, the broadsheets called it, and you could feel sub-editors quiver. The tabloids made their hungry noises. The local paper ran a photograph of the Odeon's facade with an arrow pointing to the auditorium doors, and below the fold a picture of a much younger Helen eating cake at a garden party with her brother half out of frame, the corner of his jaw makeshift and significant because we had so little else to hold. He must have decided, a radio caller said. It was his place. People die in their places, don't they? Another caller. He was locked in by someone who knew he was still inside. That's murder. A third. He locked himself in. There's your answer. The police, confronted daily by the irresistible theatrics of a door bolted from within, said the sensible thing. We have not determined intent. It is a trove, a ruin, a small planet you can spend a long time mapping. Alan's room, reassembled from things. The enamel mug had been repaired once with a coarse file, a burr taken off so a sore lip would not be cut again. The bracelet's clasp had a scratch where a small screwdriver had slipped, and on the inside of the chain 3 links were rubbed brighter from rubbing wrist against table edge. The notebook's spine had been taped with beige tape sometime in '95. The date, in his tidy script, sat like a brick in a wall of notes. Inside the cover a list of bulbs, sprockets, belts, and the phone number of a supplier who no longer existed. On the flyleaf, in a handwriting larger than his, a single sentence. Don't forget to eat. Helen's, a guess, and later a confirmation. He had built a life around repetition, and in that structure he had found some measurable contentment. If we are lucky, our habits become home. The police returned to 1997 with the vigor of people who fear what might have been missed. They reread the statements, re-knocked on doors. Carla, now living in Croydon, remembered the sound of a key brushed against metal in the stairwell and the way Mercer had said, "night," without looking up, the way people do when they have already sealed one container and started on another. The manager Patel had retired. He told the detective, "I hope he wasn't lonely," as if loneliness were a condition one could test for in the blood. The night cleaner, who had gone back to Poland, had left a forwarding address. Her niece translated on a video call, and the older woman showed them her bucket, as if props could call up memory, and said she had never gone into the auditorium after hours because she disliked the way the air felt on her teeth. The engineers surveyed the building, and then, GPs sent to a museum, surveyed their own surveys. A set of drawings from the 70s showed a fire door at the rear of the auditorium, bricked up by the 90s. A stub of corridor running nowhere evident. A crawl space above the projection screen wide enough to hold a person, but blocked with a lattice of rotten timber. The bolt itself, that beautiful puzzle piece, was an old thing, a heavy slide without a thumb latch, worked by lifting and pushing from inside the auditorium. It could not be reached from the booth or foyer. The path of least resistance was straightforward. Mercer had ended his shift, made a final walkthrough, sat down, and died. The path of most resistance required an assailant who could have unbolted from within and then vanished through an impossible wormhole. People are enamored of resistance. A simple life makes for poor theater once it stops. Helen came to the site on a weekday when the crew paused and the police had left the tape slack. She brought a tartan blanket, 3 paper cups, and a thermos of tea so strong it looked like varnish and felt like a kindness. She left the 3rd cup near the door to the auditorium because leaving things helps. She asked to see the bracelet. She held it and turned it in her fingers the way he used to. And when she looked up, there was a set to her jaw that suggested a shadow of anger, the kind reserved for physics and bureaucracy in time. He would not have liked the fuss, she said. He liked when things worked. Projectors, locks, trains that turned up when the board said. She told me he had taken her once onto the roof of the Odeon to watch the buses pool like blood at the traffic lights. He kept lists, she said, smiling without moving her lips. He would have written "die" in the margin if he'd planned it. Then she said, he was tired. That I can believe. And then, losing the set of the jaw, she put her thumb to the bracelet and closed her eyes. The days following the discovery turned Hackney into a stage for conversations spoken in lowered tones at bus stops and corner shops. The Hackney Gazette printed 2 front pages in the same week. First, a photograph of the cinema wrapped in yellow tape, headline, "Body Found in Locked Theater." Then a grainy portrait of Mercer from 1995, dug from an old staff newsletter, with the caption, "The Man Who Stayed Behind." Letters to the editor divided evenly between pity and suspicion. One scrawled, "No man locks himself inside unless he wants to be found later." Another, gentler, "He lived among reals and shadows. It makes sense he would end in the dark." An internal police memo dated February 12, 2023, read, Mercer, Alan. Confirmed deceased. Remains located Auditorium Row G, Seat 14. Bolt operated internally. Hypotheses. 1. Accidental lock-in, natural death. 2. Intentional seclusion. 3. Less likely, third-party action. See door mechanism analysis. No forensic support for assault. Recommend closure pending coroner's report. The dry sentences could not explain why officers stood a little longer than necessary under the sagging exit sign, reluctant to leave, as if the building had developed gravity around one man's chair. Helen, his sister, gave a short interview outside her flat. A reporter asked what she thought of the locked room puzzle. She tightened her coat and replied, "You're asking the wrong question. He wasn't a puzzle. He was a brother. He liked lemon biscuits. He laughed when films broke on screen because it meant they were alive." She refused further comment, but neighbors said they saw her afterwards sitting on her balcony with a mug identical to Alan's, steam rising into the cold air. Rumors spread faster than reports. One thread online insisted Mercer had been hiding from debts and died waiting for help that never came. Another proposed he had staged his own disappearance, choosing the auditorium as his coffin. A more lurid version spoke of the cinema curse. 2 vagrants who broke in during the early 2000s supposedly fled after hearing film reels turn without power. A retired usher told a podcast that she once found the notebook open to a blank page, the pencil still warm as if it had just been set down, though the building had been closed for months. Demolition workers developed their own lore. One swore the door bolt, when photographed, looked polished despite decades of disuse. Another claimed the bracelet chain felt warmer than it should have when bagged. A third said the enamel mug, though cracked, gave off a faint scent of tea when rainwater pooled inside it. None of these details made the official file, but they circulated in canteens and pubs, embroidered with every retelling until they became as persistent as fact. The coroner's conclusion, released in March, was careful. Death consistent with sudden cardiac arrest. Advanced mummification due to dry environment and sealed chamber. No evidence of trauma. Manner of death, undetermined. That word, undetermined, kept the story alive. People dislike endings that refuse to close. The cinema was torn down, yet each new flat that rose on the lot inherited the whisper that a man still sat in row G, seat 14, watching a film only he could see. Helen had the bracelet clasp prepared and wore it daily. She placed the notebook and mug on a small table by her window, arranging them beside a photograph of Alan at 20, smiling in a way age had later hidden. She sometimes brewed a cup of tea, poured it into the mug, and left it to cool untouched. When friends asked why, she only said, because he never got to finish one. The city did its quick work of transforming tragedy into content. A podcast recorded an episode rich with adjectives and light on verbs. A blogger posted 10 unsolved London mysteries with real locked rooms. And the audience settled in at number 3. Someone scanned the last page of the notebook and uploaded "Don't forget the key" as a meme for people leaving the house. A letter to the editor argued for better funding for missing persons. Another, gently, beautifully, said only, he was a man and he was loved. The demolition paused, then resumed. The wreckers took the building apart brick by brick until what had been rooms became a hill of rubble sharp enough to catch a trouser leg. At the center of that hill, the auditorium's floor lay like a scar in concrete. The rows imaginary now, like teeth remembered by tongue. If the story wants a culprit, it must borrow one from elsewhere. If the story wants an escape, it must invent an aperture. What it has instead are small, obedient facts. The lock, the notebook, the mug, the bracelet, the photograph of a sister pinned with a stubborn tack. A city that keeps moving while one of its citizens quietly stops. For those who require something more dramatic, the human body offers its own theater. Hearts stop with or without speeches. A life can end with every door correctly bolted. In the council office, the file gained an addendum and a stamp. Remains identified as Mercer, Allen, male, 39 at time of disappearance. Found, row G, seat 14, Mare Street, Odeon. Auditorium doors bolted internally at discovery. Caught undetermined. No evidence of foul play. In a different folder, a note with more softness than the form allowed. Sister notified. Requests bracelet and notebook returned after evidentiary hold lifted. Those returned things matter. The way objects carry the temperature of a life even when the hand that warmed them can't be found. After the funeral, no body, only words and a photograph. Helen put the bracelet on a small stand beside a plant that insisted on greenness in a flat that had once been 2 rooms and a dark. She kept her tea in a chipped mug and did not repair the chip. She taped the last page of his notebook inside a cabinet door, lists in a neat hand. Then that final line, missing a full stop, the way a movie sometimes truncates in projection when a frame catches and burns. She found one of his old books of cinema lore, cheap paper browning at the edges, a photograph of a projector with its covers off, and laughed at a caption that admitted there was elegance in mechanism. She checked her own locks twice, without acknowledging why, and when the bus ran late she forgave it, as if she had the power to. There's a way to imagine the last minutes that does not insult him with melodrama. He finishes his checks. He stands in the aisle and looks at the seats like a man looking into a closet, sorting what will be repaired and what can wait. The cold reaches farther when the heat cuts early to save a few pounds. He sits to rest, just for a moment, because he has carried himself to the edge of a day and the body asks to be set down. His tea is too sweet and too cold, and he smiles at his own negligence. He feels the silver band on his wrist, the cool of it, and slips a finger under it and tightens once out of habit. He remembers the key and thinks he should stand. And the thought does not quite finish its journey to muscle. He is neither frightened nor composed. He is simply, finally, tired. If there is a noise, it is the small settling noises all buildings make after midnight. If there is light, it is the green emergency glow the Odeon never could keep from flickering. He is not found for years, and the room goes on doing the only thing it knows, holding still. When the lot cleared and the excavators were hauled away, a developer put up a board showing a CGI of what would come. Pale flats with small balconies, a tree drawn fuller than London ever allows. People walked past without slowing, their lives correctly demanding most of their attention. For a few months, though, passers-by left mugs by the hoarding. Any kind, not enamel necessarily, until the council cleared them away. Someone graffitied seat 14 on the plywood in a hand less angry than careful, and for a week nobody painted it out. A boy, 9 or 10, asked his mother what it meant, and she said, "It means someone used to watch movies there." And he said, "I like movies," and she said, "Me too." And they bought ice creams because there are rituals besides grief. Years from now, when the building behind the hoarding is older than its paint, someone will tell the story on a bench and get the details wrong, and then write again. Maybe it was row F. Maybe the bracelet was gold. Maybe it wasn't a bolt at all, but a chain. It will survive not because it asks for solution, but because it respects an ordinary man's vanishing enough to keep him in the inventory. The locked door is dramatic. The quiet is truer. In that quiet, the artifacts, a mug, a notebook, a jacket whose corduroy ribs remember the shape of the shoulders they warmed, a photograph pinholed into corkboard, a bracelet catching light like a thin ring of moon. In that quiet, a city acknowledging, between adverts and schedules and emails, that a life can end the way a film reel does. A soft flurry, a brief flash where the strip burns, a click as the tail slaps out, and then a white stillness in which everyone sits for a second longer than they planned, not ready to stand, not ready to let the light go.